So welcome, everybody. My name is Philip Lee, and I'm General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication. WACC is an international non-governmental organization that promotes the implementation of communication rights as a foundation for achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and making genuine social progress. Unfulfilled expectations dating back over 50 years to the widespread call for a new World Information and Communication Order, or NWICO as it was called, have spiraled into the digital age. These unfulfilled expectations relate to the positive role that communication technologies and media could play in society, government and corporate interests allowing, given more equitable, democratic and balanced communication flows and infrastructures. Statements, manifestos, declarations, pledges, multiple names for texts that seek to emphasize ethical and practical positions and recommended actions for the greater good of humanity. Many such documents have been produced by civil society networks, intergovernmental forums, conferences, and even political bodies. But how much impact can such statements make? What more can we do to overcome obstacles to their recognition and implementation? And with the World Summit on the Information Society, or WSIS +20, now planned for 2025, what should we be doing in the next 2 years to turn some of these words into a reality on the ground? A recent issue of WACC's journal Media Development highlighted several statements on communication from over the past 2 decades. The language of the documents shows that despite a radical transformation of global communications since the 1970s, most recently with the astonishingly rapid deployment of digital platforms, the democratization of communication has remained a persistent yet unattained vision. Statements have a long shelf life, but limited impact. And despite their impeccable rationales, it often proves difficult to translate words into actions in order to bring about necessary change. In this conversation circle, we shall hear from 4 people who have been involved in drafting or supporting such initiatives, speaking about how to more effectively translate words into actions for positive change. And this will be followed by comments and questions. Just 1 or 2 practical details. First, please would you write questions and comments in the chat? Please would you keep yourself on mute unless you're called upon to speak. To begin with, each speaker will introduce her or himself and say how and why they have been involved in creating statements. And first, I'd like to turn to Miriam Horngren, who's a social change strategist. Miriam, perhaps you could give us your views on these matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to sound, poor Philip, I'm going to sound awful. I didn't write a statement. I wasn't part of writing a statement. But basically, I was the coordinator for the CRIS campaign from 2002, I think, till 2005. So that's a long time ago. And basically, I was involved in, I guess, influencing statements in the sense that I worked hard with some of the CRIS members at the time to develop a discourse for the campaign, a story, a utopia, a dream of what the internet should be. And so this is how I got involved. And at the moment I work with organizations, or up until now I've been working with organizations, accompanying them on communications, advocacy and social change for greater impact. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Miriam. That's interesting that you speak of influencing statements, an influencer for this. That seems to be very important in this day and age as we're learning. Now, I can't see if I have Suman Basnet present. I don't have everybody here. If he's here.
Hi, Philip, I'm here. I'm sorry I was late.
Wonderful. No. Welcome indeed. I just don't see your image amongst the few that have gathered on my screen here. Good to see you, Suman. Thank you. Regional Director of AMARC, Asia Pacific. Please give us your views on these matters. Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure where we were in the conversation at the moment, but I gathered from Miriam's statement that we were basically introducing ourselves. Is that right, Philip?
Yes, and perhaps saying something about how you've been involved or affected by the production of statements over the decades.
Right. Well, I'm sorry, I don't have much to say in that regard, but nevertheless, once again, hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Kathmandu, Nepal. As Philip has already said, my name is Suman, and I work for the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, famously known as AMARC, the acronym from its name in French, which unfortunately I don't pronounce so well, so I don't even dare to go there. Well, speaking after Miriam, who is really been an engine of a lot of the drive in the movement in communications right and all of that, I think I should be very, very modest, and truthfully so. In fact, my involvement with writing a statement, supporting declarations has been mostly limited to what I do as part of my work in AMARC. We do issue statements, supporting statements of our partners. Our statements have mostly to do with right to information, communications right, freedom of expression. But most importantly, our declarations, our statements are geared towards having, or rather allowing or letting the most marginalized in local communities have access, ownership, most importantly, the right to operate means of community communication. And in the case of AMARC, it's mainly community radio. So we do issue statements in support of our partners by way of achieving our policy advocacy goals, by becoming partners, supporting statements issued by our partners. So it's basically limited to that. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Marvelous. Thank you, Suman. We'll come back to you on some of those issues, I'm sure. The third panelist for today is Zoe Titus of the Namibia Media Trust. Very pleased to see you, Zoe. Perhaps you could give us a little introduction to yourself and your views on the matter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'm Zoe Titus. I'm based in Windhoek in Namibia, where I am the director of the Namibia Media Trust. I'm also chairperson of the Global Forum for Media Development and chairperson of the African Platform on Access to Information. Yes, I've been involved in quite a number of statements, drafting of declarations, etc., etc. I'm just going to, I think probably just mention the most prominent, which would be the African Platform on Access to Information, the API Declaration, looking solidly at the right to access to information, particularly in Africa. There are numerous UNESCO World Press Freedom Day statements and conference declarations, and most recently in 2021, the Windhoek Plus 30 statement or declaration on information as a public good, and then last year the review process of the UN Plan of Action for the safety of journalists and issue of impunity. I think in the African context, what is critical for us as activists is the review of the 2002 Declaration of Principles on access to information, on freedom of expression and access to information. The review took place, and we facilitated the review in Southern Africa, and those principles were then adopted in 2019. The African Commission guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, and now through the GFMD, I'm involved in the process of revising and renewing principles for effective media assistance. You've mentioned statements. think we need to clarify statements, declarations. They are different kinds of documents and they serve different purposes. Yes, I think in civil society, especially in civil society, I started my career as a media monitor for the Media Institute of Southern Africa. So my work was to monitor on a daily basis violations of media freedom and freedom of expression. And the first thing that we would do was to issue a statement, because that statement was the first document to ensure that that information became available, was now in the public domain. And it's very, very critical that those statements become then, part of, the record of history. Yeah.
Marvelous. Thank you, Zoe, for that. It's the first time I think us Britishers, we say windhop. That's the first time I've heard it pronounced correctly. So that's useful. Thank you. Now, our fourth panelist is Stephen Brown, who I know very well. He will introduce himself and set a position, I think, around what we're discussing. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, so my name's Stephen Brown. I'm originally from the United Kingdom, but I've been living in France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, France again since 1991. So you probably might still be able to detect a bit of a Liverpool accent. Here I'm attending as the president of the European region of the World Association for Christian Communication. But I also work with the communications department of the World Council of Churches. I'm editor of their 3-monthly journal, quarterly journal, the Ecumenical Review. And in the past, I've worked as a journalist. I've worked for Globe Ethics Net, which is a global ethics foundation, and also worked in the European Parliament, which certainly produces a lot of statements, declarations, and papers of different kinds. And before that, for the peace movement in the UK, but working on international issues. So working with a wide range of partners from different countries around the world, but particularly from Europe and the North America in the 1980s, when the issue of the deployment of nuclear weapons was high on the agenda. I've been involved in drafting many different kinds of statements in all of these different responsibilities, going through from the peace movement through one of the statements I was very much involved in, which is in the issue of media development that Philip spoke about, and I don't know if don't know quite what it says, but back in 1991, in the summer of 1991, when there was a coup in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was taken to house arrest in a dacha in the Soviet Union. I was working in the European Parliament for the British Labour members of the European Parliament, and because it was summer, nobody was there. There weren't mobile phones. There wasn't email. You might be able to get a fax sent to a hotel of one of the places where the leader of the British Labour group was staying on holiday. But basically, he sort of says, well, you get on with it, it's fine by me. So I ended up drafting the very first draft of the statement of the European Parliament on the coup in the Soviet Union, which of course then got amended and changed as it went through the system. I mean, I've written a list of the different things statements can do. I particularly liked what I think Zoe just said about the records of history, because I'm also a contemporary historian, and really it's part of my trade to be able to go back through statements, because they, in a sense, are a snapshot of particular institutions at particular times, particular environments in which they're working. But but statements and meetings and conferences, issuing statements, there can be a whole panoply of different reasons and different purposes for these statements, different kinds of audiences. And I can say maybe a little bit more about that as we go through the discussion. Thank you very much. It's great to be here and to be.
Marvelous. Thank you, Stephen. I'm interested in the historical perspective there. One reason we pulled them together in media development far more than we were able to put in there as well. So it's a place you can point to and say, well, here they are on there. That's great. We've got a range of backgrounds and experiences here. I'm wondering, what can we learn from the process of the past? I mean, what can we learn from past declarations or statements and ways of organizing? Would you comment on what you feel might have been effective, what was not, how things could be done differently going forward? Let's assume that there will be more statements or whatever in due course, particularly coming up to WSIS +20. But what are your views on that? Perhaps let's go around the same order again. Miriam, do you have a view on any of these matters?
I'll keep to history then, I guess. If we were on that, I think the Chris campaign, we issued statements. We actually because what the Chris campaign was able to do in the WSIS process was really to influence the governance of the summit itself, i.e. the level of participation. And it was the first time that a UN summit engaged to the extent that it did with civil society as pretty much nearly an equal participant to the states and the private sector. And I mean, this didn't happen nicely. It was arm twisting that happened. But I think civil society at the time, and the Chris campaign more specifically, was extremely united and was not prepared to just have a discourse from the UN about what the summit had to be. They wanted that participation, that change of governance, in effect, and that meant negotiating times in meetings, negotiating times in discussions around the text that were coming out of the WSIS process. And so I think for me, originally the major victory was able to push through a change in the governance process of the international relations decision process. How much influence then on the text did we have? It depends who you talk to. For some people, it was, for people, especially at the time, there was a bit of a gap between what was about at the time right to communicate and information issues. So there was a bit of a competition between the people of the Chris campaign that pushed for a right to communicate, and we changed our language to communication rights as a unit of rights that allow not only the diffusion, but the interaction, the dialogue. Whilst the people more involved with preserving Article 19, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, were worried that that right specifically was going to get diluted. So there was kind of, at the beginning at least, some kind of power struggles there. What Chris was able to do, both because of its discourse and I think because of a strategy, was able to actually bring together those two things and really become the respondent of civil society to the governments. So I think that's where the victories were. The statements, we're never going to find that it goes far enough. That it was reflective really of the world we dreamt of for the internet and for the online communications, and I think that's probably the main learning. What is also really interesting is to see what we hadn't planned for and the unexpected. And in fact, as far as statements, we had a lot more impact on the Convention of Cultural Diversity, the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, than we did on any of the statements of WSIS. The great thing is conventions are legally binding. So, but we didn't intend that. Our strategy was not originally to influence the convention so it was the time and the space we took during WSIS allowed us to be a lot more effective because recognized and with a strong image and branding, let's put it that way, and presence and network across the world. We grew from 2-3 chapters to over 500 in the space of 5 years, with different countries taking up the CRIS charter and saying, this is going to be our roadmap. So the CRIS kind of founding document was the roadmap for campaigns individually in individual countries to be completely emancipated. We had no money. So people, I call that the Al-Qaeda strategy, have a good branding, have a strong commitment and let people run with it, take it and run with it. And it gave them the framework to be able to move forward. Now, then that kind of mass of CRIS chapters and networks involved meant that the perception of the kind of impact of CRIS was probably higher than we really did. That's communication, right? That's campaigning. And I think in a way we had more impact where it mattered. We had less impact where we wanted to.
Right, thank you. I'll invite the other panelists to comment on anything each one of you says. You'll pick up on that. But Miriam, just quickly, do you think that we need a communication rights in the digital society campaign now that would be significantly different in some way?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on the issue, so I would be really uncomfortable saying that. I think what I can answer is, should we have a discussion about how we organize around the internet and the digital world now? And especially with ChatGPT and all artificial intelligence, I think we're late. We're very late. Globally, we need something as, I'd say, powerful that CRIS was, but it would probably have a different form.
Thank you. Suman, I'm sure there's lots there that would interest you, but I'm wondering also what's missing from debates today that civil society might wish to pick up on from your perspective.
Thanks, Philip. And I think it's really inspiring to listen to from Miriam once again about the CRIS campaign. I think that was truly an inspiring campaign. I'll start on a positive note. I think the civil society sector, especially the ones that have a rights-based approach to their work, have made a noticeably significant impact in the international process, including the World Summit on Information Society, or WSIS. I think the participation of the civil society sector has been particularly useful in helping developing countries access and benefit from these processes, and as well as the outcomes. Those that have followed the WSIS process closely and from the standpoint of civil society organizations will have a deeper understanding, and many of you are here in the panel. I'm surely not one of them. What I would like to at this point very generally focus on is just a few points that I see as shortcomings in relation to the declarations and the statements in the past. I'm basically going to that part of your question where it says what was effective, what was not. And I think from a very personal experience, I would like to focus a little bit on what was not, or what could have been more effective. I think what we have not done as effectively as is needed, perhaps, is to build a supporting network around a statement. Other than, I mean, CRIS campaign definitely was a very different and inspiring case, as I've said. But generally speaking, other than the main issuing organization, it is seldom clear who else is responsible for pushing the text. I think I see that as a major shortcoming, really. And I also feel that what has not been done adequately is to consider in advance if all the signatories representing different networks or organizations are equally committed to a statement. I think the ways a lot of time, the way a statement or a text has been followed up or has moved forward raises doubts in one's mind. If you know, I think it's most of the time it's not clear if the stakeholders of a statement have the ability to put words into action, if you like. Take, for example, the statement that have been issued against the, as a protest against the military takeover of Myanmar. My organization has been part of it. I'm sure many of yours have participated in speaking against it. We all protested. But further to that we lack the capacity to follow through in a way that would mean something tangibly beneficial for our colleagues in that country. And that's just an example, I think. Therefore, I think it's vitally important that we, through these points, make sure that a network or an ecosystem is in place to help carry the text forward before committing to a text, really. And I think that consideration has to happen before we actually commit to a text, before the crafting even begins. In fact, developing a statement or declaration, and I often think about this, may just be an opportunity to develop or strengthen an existing ecosystem or a network that is required for the statement to succeed. In my mind, this is I say this not as a comment on others, but I'm in a way reflecting, introspecting, doing a lot of introspection as I speak, as I listen to all of you. I think there's a serious case for, to plan differently when we're dealing with statement right from the beginning.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wonder too whether sometimes we're not quite sure who it is we're addressing or who it is we're tackling. I know this, in a sense, might have been the case with the first WSIS. We thought we knew it was the ITU. We thought there were governance procedures that could be tackled, as it were, but it's not really clear this time round anyway who's in charge. Who do we criticize? Who do we try and persuade? I mean, in that sense, which might be part of the issue. Zoe, Windhoek, famous, of course, for press freedom statements and so on, and you came back to it 20 years afterwards and so on. What's your take on this? I'm not sure Zoe hasn't frozen. On my screen, she's there. Just putting headphones on. Okay. Hi, Zoe. Can you hear now?
I can hear you now. Sorry about that.
No, that's quite.
You can see that I've also changed the venue. There was, a little surge in the power, so I had to move about quickly. Right.
Thank you. So did you get the question there? To return to your setting in Namibia, twice now there's been powerful statements on press freedom, freedom of expression and so on. And Suman's talking about the need for a supporting network and equal commitments and so on. Did you find that was an issue in your country or in the context of Africa generally?
I think what is important to note is that the 1991 Windhoek Declaration came at a very specific time in the social and political history of the continent. This was just after 1990 when Namibia became independent. So there was euphoria and there was renewed energy for the freedoms that came with it. And that's one of the reasons why Windhoek was selected to host that UNESCO conference that resulted in the Windhoek Declaration. African journalists are very emotional, have a very emotional stake in the Windhoek Declaration. There is great ownership of this declaration. I think that makes a very, very fundamental, it has a fundamental impact on how that declaration is going to be implemented and how people and journalists are going to respond to that. So that sense of ownership, because it really, really and truly, let's say, articulates the aspirations and the needs and desires of the media at that time. I mean, it was developed by senior journalists and editors. And yes, I think
think one of the reasons also why, I mean, the Windhoek Declaration was such a fundamentally important document because it was the catalyst then for similar declarations around the world. So, I mean, we always refer to the Windhoek Declaration as Africa's gift to the world. And then, yes, 30 years later, you've got the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration on Information as a Public Good. I think the phrasing or that meaning that is associated with information as a public good is so critically important at this point in our history in the world, where communication and information rights and the issues around them, freedom of expression, etc., have evolved so dramatically. Yes, unfortunately, I wasn't around in 1990, but I certainly could play my role in 2021. But I did want to pick up at least I heard a few comments made earlier, but I did want to touch on something that Miriam said, which I think is very important. I think step one when it comes to what we've learned from declarations is that step one would be that there must be clarity on the motivation of that action. And then an understanding that negotiation down the line is going to be required. I mean, if I could put this into broader context, in your area of work, you'd be familiar with the 1985 Kairos document, which was a Christian biblical and theological comment on the political crisis in South Africa, which emerged, and it emerged from the anti-apartheid struggle, which was and was a devastating critique, I think, of apartheid and the challenge to the church in that society to respond to the injustices suffered by the majority of South Africans. So just in terms of a more contemporary example and how we experience this process was the Apartheid Declaration. And I wanted to touch on that just briefly because I think it might help us with this conversation. So it was around 2009 when the organization that I was working for at the time, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, MISA, we asked ourselves, the question, we have the Windhoek Declaration, and that is being implemented because there is political will and there's push behind it. And then since then, we've also responded to the liberalization of the airwaves through the African Charter on Broadcasting. So the question was, what's the next critical issue that we needed to tackle? And then we consulted our partners across the continent, and following consultations, we concluded that the next big thing would be access to information. A declaration that would look at the right to access to information in all its manifestations, a sub-objective being to look at the right to act, to push for the adoption of such legislation on the continent that would guarantee citizens this or provide citizens with this legal guarantee. So clearly there was enough evidence already, and I think we all agree that the critical importance of this right is acknowledged, particularly for development and the attainment of development goals in the global south. So what we've learned, and this is a question you asked, what we've learned from this is there needs to be that clear motivation and acknowledgement for the need for collective action. What I think we've also learned is that it requires commitment and a vision and strategic partnerships. So if possible, I think this is based also then on the nature of the statement or declaration. If possible, include your advocacy and lobbying objectives, because that's what we did with the Apartheid Declaration, one of them being to expand the African Commission's declaration to reflect the right to access to information more substantively, and then also to campaign for the acknowledgement or the acknowledgement of September 28th as the International Right to Know Day, or the International Day for Access to Information. It took 10 years, and I'm glad to say that we were successful. We successfully campaigned, and today, September 28th, is the International Day for Universal Access to Information. That required a lot of negotiation on the text, but yes, what I'm trying to say, or trying to come back to, is that civil society certainly has the capacity to impact global policy, and it requires clear motivation, acknowledgement, and collective action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zoe. I mean, that's a great segue into Stephen, actually. Many of the things that you touched on there are concerns of WACC, but also areas I know that Stephen has worked in as well. Stephen, do you want to pick up there? Obviously, some of these are ethical questions, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's talking about statements is such a wide discussion because there are so many, not only different kinds of statements, but different purposes. Sometimes we have them to register that we've met, we've got a process, to set out what our consensus is. Sometimes they're about trying to grab attention, to change things in the world. Sometimes they're there as a substitute for action. We don't know quite what we should do, so we'll draw up a statement. Sometimes they're about setting out issues, problems, sometimes about offering solutions, sometimes identifying what's missing in declarations or statements or processes of wider institutions. Sometimes they're about building coalitions. And in building a coalition with the statement, I come back to a little bit to what Suman said about the need to have buy-in. But having buy-in may also sometimes weaken a statement. So I think in a way, when we talk about statements, we're also thinking about what's their purpose, what's their audience. Sometimes the audience of a statement is us, those who've drawn it up, not necessarily the outside world. Sometimes they're kind of like expanded calling cards. When we're in meetings and negotiating with UN agencies or other bodies, to have something in our hands and say, this is where we stand, is useful as a calling card. But what's important is the process of negotiation, the personal contacts, the energy that we put in before a meeting starts, not waiting until the meeting is there and then trying to influence it. So you've got that whole panoply of different things that statements can be used for, and sometimes they can be used for different purposes at the same time, and sometimes that's a really positive thing, and sometimes maybe less positive because we're trying to cover too many bases at the same time. So, I mean, going back decades into the 1980s, when I was working with the peace movement and the European peace movements, in a way we had two different kinds of, maybe more, but three different processes going on at the same time. We had the kind of the mass demonstrations in the streets, which showed where public opinion was. We had our statements as call to action. I mean, short things, maybe a little bit like what MISA was doing, to say, this is where we stand, this is what the important issue is. And then we had other processes where we were talking with people involved in negotiations and trying to put in our own, put in our take on the process and what the important issues were to follow up. So you've got that whole panoply of different things, but I mean, I wanted at some point, maybe now's the point, or maybe in the next round, to talk a little bit about the statement on communication for social justice in a digital age, because in a way, Philip started off, and several contributors around panelists have talked about the history and historical approach and building on things. I'm a little bit of what I sometimes call the ecumenical dinosaur, meaning that I've been around in the ecumenical world for a very long time. And I remember the 1983 assembly of the World Council of Churches, which I was attending as a very, very young steward at the time, but someone really quite interested in some of these questions. And one of the issue groups we had there was on communicating credibly. And that came out of a process Philip might remember, which involved the World Council of Churches, WACC, World Federation, and other organizations, which was really trying to hold together two things. One was what's happening in the communication and media world now, and what's our ethical take, and what's our take in the case of WCC as people involved in churches and church institutions. And much of that, lurking somewhere in the background, was the whole process of the New World Information and Communication Order, which was a kind of thing happening in the secular world, but one which WACC was involved in, and which in a way we were trying to see how that interacted with the World Council of Churches. And the statement that's in the media development communication for social justice in the digital age, in a way that's a little bit like saying we want to pick up the discussion that we had, but to pick it up within the digital age. Some of the principles, the ethical positions may be the same, but we're working with different technologies, we're working in a very different media environment. And what does this mean for communication? What does it mean for WACC? But also, what does it mean for a global organization like the World Council of Churches? So it's both ecumenical reflection, ethical reflection, pointers for action as to what we want, where we want to see how things go. And it's also about, in a sense, again, about coalition building, trying to build a coalition between WACC, between church-based organizations, media-based organizations, trying to identify really what are the burning issues in terms of communication, social justice, and the digital age. And one way in which that was then picked up was that within the World Council of Churches, that became the basis for a discussion within the WC's Communication Committee, which then drew up its own statement, which was different in the sense it had particular ethical, Christian, ecumenical input, but very much complementary to this statement. And that then got fed through into the assembly that happened in Karlsruhe last year. And eventually from that, we got an assembly. The assembly initiated the statement on that. Now, all of that could remain just on paper, but it can also be an important orientation for us within the ecumenical movements, in this case, within the World Council of Churches, because we have something that's been registered by the assembly and in a sense supported by the assembly, we can then pick that up and take that into our program plans. And we had a discussion last week about how we might do that and where it might be lodged. So statements can be very, very wide-ranging things, and maybe one of the things that we need to do is to think before we start drawing up the statement, think, why are we drawing it up? What's it for? Is it for us? Is it for the outside world? Is it a bit of both? Is it to bring in other people into the discussion who haven't been there up to now? I think in a way, a statement by itself doesn't necessarily change doesn't necessarily change anything. But with the Kairos statement, I think it's also arrived at a Kairos moment in South Africa. So you had both the situation and the statement which meshed together. And sometimes then the statement can take on a life of its own.
Thank you, Stephen. A very strong echo there, of course, communicating credibly on the whole issue around fake news, truth-telling today, and so on. Very powerful image coming in there. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to bring in anybody that has questions or comments to make that's listening to the panelists. I'm wondering whether we could just focus very tightly in on gaps and opportunities, maybe something that, think that has been omitted previously, or that is just staring us in the face now. Where should we spend our energies in the next two years, I would think, as we move towards WSIS plus 20? So if anybody has anything to say on there, Zoe, you just raise your hand. Yeah, please leap in, and we'll look for questions from participants as well.
I just wanted to follow up on something Stephen said, and which I think is very important. I think that we are facing a Kairos moment right now. In South Africa, globally, when we see the absolute disparities in incomes, all the social justice issues that are affecting our society. So there is need for a review and another Kairos moment, and this is ideally what I think potentially the WSIS can at least do in the context of communication. I mean, what I wanted to say, you asked Philip what is missing, and I think maybe I hope that I'm not repeating, but again, I think depending on the objective, there is really need for broader multi-stakeholder participation, and this includes government, especially if we are hoping for the political will that is necessary for implementation of these statements or declarations. And I think we need to think about intersectionalities in what we do, and that comes through when we think about these intersectionalities. That would be the foundation for multi-stakeholder approaches. What I think we can potentially do more of is a renewed and very comprehensive and inclusive focus on grassroots voices, youth voices, voices of Indigenous peoples. What my experience is, and also in terms of policy advocacy, I don't know what your experience is, but at least on this side of the world, funder commitment by donors and funders that has been short-term, which has not been geared towards sustainability, which have not acknowledged the fact that these statements are tied to long-term policy advocacy objectives. So a long-term commitment is needed.
Thank you, Zoe. Miriam, gaps, opportunities?
I live in France, and at the moment, like in other places in the world, there are a million people on the streets. And I think everywhere, whether it's Israel or Peru or Chile or France, the fight is against losing more rights. Basically, the story that I'm gathering is against losing rights that have been chipped away, whether human, whether social, and now environmental rights. So everything we're holding the fort, gender-based violence, etc. We're just holding the fort. We're trying to lose less. And I think that's not going to get us anywhere. I think we have to imagine what we want. No one. I think it's just very difficult to mobilize people on trying to save a piece of furniture. I think you mobilize people, you gather that energy. That's what we was talking about, that passion. That is the basis of it. And did we have passionate people at CRIS? Too passionate at times. I even saw people try to punch each other with, and that was not what we're calling for, but it did show passion. And you don't foster passion on fighting against. You foster passion on fighting for, on building a utopia. And I don't care if the utopia is not supposed to happen. You get people together on commonalities if they can adhere to a story. Human beings are storytellers, story listeners, story actors. We all create our own stories in our own imagination. So I think the urgency now is, considering the context where we're going, is going to look really hard. What is it the world we want? And what kind of communication and information world we want within that world?
Great, thank you, Miriam. Suman, you feeling optimistic or pessimistic?
Somewhere in the middle, Philip. I think I have a question in my mind. I think Miriam alluded to bringing people together, mobilizing. Joey, a little while earlier, talked about collective motivation. And the question that comes to my mind is, how does one go about creating that collective motivation? That, to me, is a huge challenge, especially when you're working in an extremely diverse political, cultural, very importantly, linguistic context. And give on one hand you have that, on the other hand you have a very complex process that's not easy to follow. Take, for example, the case of WSIS. It's not an easy procedure to follow. Not everyone understands. I don't understand it fully. I participated in WSIS process since 2003. I've tagged along with other colleagues from AMARC, and I don't completely understand it. I know from my network, when I talk to members of my network, they don't understand it fully. Unless we find a way of bringing everybody on board, how do you really create a force that can even make a difference? Or even before that, how do you even create a collective motivation to sit together for a body of text, and then to be able to support it all through? I think that to me is very, very important. So in my opinion, I think and the other thing I have in mind is the place where we really need to start, once again, is to ask ourselves, what is the role of civil society in internet governance, and what impact can it have during the World Summit on Information Society? I think Stephen made some very profound statements. I completely agree that the underlying principles, the nuances, the philosophy is the same. We're just dealing with a different technology, which brings about massive changes in the way what it hinders and what it allows for. But nevertheless, I think it's time that we ask ourselves this question once again as to what is our role, and then how do we go about it? I think that's very, very important.
Marvelous, thank you. So we have barely 4 minutes left to this session. I'd just like to highlight some key words that, in a sense, that have come out. Of course, there's a lot more around the edges and a lot more depth to this, but we've agreed, I think, that we need clarity of motivation. We need supporting networks, which is something similar to the coalition building that was mentioned, and the need for multi-stakeholder participation. And underlying all this is, of course, genuine access to information and knowledge, the communicating credibly echo that we heard there. So I would like to thank Miriam Horngren, Suman Basnet, Stephen Brown, and Zoe Titus for their contributions, for taking part in the conversation circle. And perhaps I could just leave you with a thought. Civicus, a respected partner organization in the field of communication and democracy, has just published its State of Civil Society Report 2023. And I just want to read one paragraph there, buried amongst all the other good bits of information that it contains. It says, much of civil society's radical energy is coming from outside the NGO universe, from small, informal grassroots groups, often formed and led by women, young people, and indigenous people. They are taking action on issues that directly matter to them, such as the lack of economic opportunities, the climate crisis that threatens to rob them of their futures, and the denial of the rights of excluded groups to which they belong. So it seems quite evident that if statements are to continue to have real value, including the voices and opinions of informal grassroots groups, is as important as those of established NGOs. And that seems to me key to this idea of multi-stakeholder participation and coalition building. So thank you once again, panelists. Thank you for taking part in the conversation circle, all those that are listening in from various different countries and so on. And we'll look forward to having a second conversation, perhaps with a different group, perhaps even with the same group, who knows, in the very near future. Thank you. And
thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Right.